The wind howled like a wounded animal outside the cabin, clawing at the shutters and piling snow against the thick oak door. Inside, the fire crackled low in the stone hearth, casting a dull orange glow across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Boone Callahan sat at the pine wood table, hunched over a chipped tin plate that held nothing but a wedge of hard cheese and half a raw onion. The knife in his hand was sharp, but his appetite was not. He hadn't spoken to another living soul in 5 months, hadn't needed to. That was the whole point of living up here, tucked high in the Wind River Range, miles from the nearest town, let alone another beating heart. Just the land, the cold, and the memories. He was a mountain of a man, 6'5" and all scar and bone, wrapped in a worn leather vest over a wool shirt, gone soft with age. His wide-brimmed brown hat hung by the door, beaded with frost from his morning wood run. The cabin, built by his father's hands, smelled of pine smoke and old sorrow. He was mid-bite when the knock came. Soft, then again 3 times. Even. Steady. Not the frantic hammering of a traveler lost in snow, but something more deliberate. Boone froze. He stared at the door. Nothing and no one had come up this way in years. His boots thudded against the floor as he rose, heart ticking louder than usual in his chest. He crossed the room, hand brushing the rifle that hung by the wall but didn't lift it. Instead, he opened the door. There she stood, barefoot in the snow. A little girl, no taller than his thigh, with long corn-blonde hair tangled over thin shoulders. She wore a pale blue dress that fluttered in the wind like it belonged to summer, not to this biting Wyoming winter. Her cheeks were raw with cold, her nose pink, but she didn't cry. She looked him dead in the eye. "I need a home," she said, chin high. "And you need someone to cook." Boone blinked once. The wind rushed in behind her, stinging cold and disbelief with it. He glanced past her, expecting a wagon, a horse, parents, a prank. But there was only the white sweep of snow-covered trail behind her, and one set of small footprints that ended right at his door. "You walked here?" he asked. She gave a single nod. "From the bridge. Mr. Sandin's boy brought me up that far on his mule, but I told him to leave me. I needed to ask for myself." "Ask who?" "You," she said simply. Boone narrowed his eyes. "Where are your parents?" "They crossed the ice," she said, like it explained everything. "Didn't come back. They said it'd be safe by the second freeze, but it cracked. Mr. Henrik found the sled half sunk. The words were too clean, too calm. A child's version of tragedy scrubbed down to the parts she could bear. Boone had heard that tone before, in war, in orphan camps, in wounded men trying not to bleed on their boots. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said gruffly. "I'm not asking to stay forever. Just long enough to make us both warm meals and clean the dust from your shelves. Maybe longer, if you think I'm worth it." She said it without tears, without begging, just the plain-spoken resolve of someone who'd already been told no too many times and chose not to accept it. Boone stared at her, jaw clenched. Every practical part of him screamed to send her back. Send for the preacher. Send for the county marshal. Send her anywhere but here. Instead, he stepped aside. The girl didn't hesitate. She walked through the threshold like she belonged. The door shut behind her with a low thump. And just like that, Boone Callahan wasn't alone anymore. The cabin hadn't changed in 5 years. A single room with a wood stove and a loft bed, walls lined with tools and old books, a table built by his grandfather and 2 chairs, though only one ever saw use. She scanned the place like a seasoned housekeeper. "Is that mold in the bread box?" "No," Boone muttered, "but it might have been." She reached for a dish towel, shook the dust from it, and began cleaning with the precision of someone who needed everything to have its place. "What's your name?" he asked, finally shaking himself from shock. "Letty Mae Harper," she said. I'm 6.5. Mama said Letty means joy, but I don't feel it much since they went under. Boone rubbed a hand over his jaw, stubble rasping. And who sent you to me? Miss June at the general store said you lived alone, and that maybe you were lonely but too stubborn to say so. Damn June. She said you might pretend to be gruff, but deep down you've got the kind of heart that remembers how to care. Boone snorted. Miss June talks too much. She said you were big enough to scare off trouble, but not so mean you'd slam a door on a girl in a dress with holes in it. She turned to him, tilting her chin. I can earn my keep. You won't regret it. Boone crossed his arms, towering like a pine over her. You know I could say no. You could, she said, but I don't think you will. Silence fell thick between them. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind keened like something mourning. Are you hungry? He asked. I'm always hungry, she answered, but I can make beans stretch 3 ways if you have salt and a pot. Boone moved to the cupboard and pulled out a tin of beans, a sack of flour, and what little else he had. She examined them with narrowed eyes. This is survival food, she said. Not meal food. You eat like you forgot what a kitchen's for. He didn't argue, just handed her a match for the stove. She lit it with practiced hands, dragging a wooden crate over to reach the counter. Then, as if she'd lived here all her life, she got to work. He watched her from the table, not speaking, just watching. The way her hands moved, the way her lips murmured measurements under her breath, the way she didn't shake, even though the storm outside hadn't let up. Where'd you learn to cook? Mama, she said without looking up, before she got too tired to stand. I had to take over some things, she said. A warm meal is half a roof. Boone didn't know what that meant, but it sounded true. She served the beans hot with half a biscuit she'd pulled together from scrap flour and grease. It wasn't good, but it wasn't bad. And it tasted a whole lot more like a meal than raw onion and jerky. Boone ate in silence. She cleaned the pan. When the plate was empty, she looked up at him. Can I stay the night? He nodded. And tomorrow? We'll see. She smiled then. Not the polite kind, the kind that made her green eyes light up and reminded him of his daughter, the one he'd buried on a frozen spring morning 7 years ago. I'll be up early, she said, climbing into the old loft bed like she'd done it 100 times. Boone didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the fire watching the snow stack high against the windows and listened to the quiet breathing of a child who hadn't flinched once since stepping into his world. He had no idea what kind of storm had just entered his life, but something told him it wouldn't pass easy. And when dawn broke cold and gray across the range, Boone realized something else. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't waiting for the silence. He was waiting for her voice to come from the loft and say, "What's for breakfast?" He didn't know it yet, but that question and the girl asking it were about to change everything. The smell hit Boone before he even opened the door. He'd been outside splitting pine, sweat steaming off his back despite the cold, when the scent drifted out through the chimney. It wasn't the warm, nutty scent of rising bread or the comforting richness of stewed beans. No, this was smoke, acrid, bitter, wrong. Boone dropped the axe mid-swing and bolted toward the cabin, boots pounding over snow-packed ground. He shoved the door open just as a billow of black smoke rolled out and punched him in the face. Inside, chaos reigned. Flour dusted every surface like early snowfall. The stove hissed and popped. A small pot on the back burner gurgled with something gray and bubbling. And there in the middle of it all stood Letty face streaked with soot, hands shaking, dress speckled with dough, staring into the open oven with wide, wet eyes. "No, no, no," she muttered. "You're supposed to rise." Not burn. Boone grabbed the closest rag and swung open the nearest window, coughing as smoke clawed at his lungs. He rushed to the stove, pulled open the oven door all the way, and stared at what had once been dough. Now it was a charred lump, blackened and cracked, curled like a dying animal on the iron tray. Letty didn't look at him. She stood stiff, like one more wrong move would shatter her. Boone reached for the pot next, yanked it off the stove before it boiled over. He turned off the flame, then turned to her. "I followed the recipe," she said in a voice too tight for a child. "I followed it exactly. Mama's bread never failed before." He didn't answer right away. Just coughed again and opened the back door to let in cold air, chasing out the smoke. When he looked back at her, she was staring at the ruined loaf like it had betrayed her. "It's just bread," Boone said finally. "No, it's not." Her voice cracked on the words. "This was hers. This was the one thing I had left, the one thing I thought I could still do right." Her bottom lip trembled. She scrubbed her sleeve against her eyes, smearing flour and soot together. Boone had seen men cry, had heard sobs torn from throats in war, from pain, from grief, too deep for words. But somehow this hit harder. A 6-year-old girl who'd stood taller than a blizzard now crumbling over a burned loaf of bread. He stepped toward her, crouched down to eye level, and gently took the singed recipe book from the counter. The leather binding was cracked, the corners softened from handling. He opened to the page that had a faint dusting of flour across the top. The handwriting was delicate, neat, feminine, but the page itself had been water damaged. Some of the ink had faded, smudged. Where the oven temperature should have been was only a ghost of a number. The rise time barely visible. Measurements blurred into the paper like secrets lost to time. "This recipe's missing pieces," he said, holding it out. "I know." Letty's voice was small. "It got wet." When they crossed the ice, when the sled fell through, she sniffled. "I tried to dry it. But some parts are just gone now. Just like them." Boone looked down at the page again, then at the girl with her fists clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. The silence in the cabin wrapped around them, heavy, thick, and full of things unsaid. He stood, closed the book softly, and looked at her. "We'll figure it out together." Letty blinked. "You know how to make it?" "I remember pieces. My mama used to bake on Sundays. I was more interested in licking the bowl than learning, but I remember the smell, the color of the crust, how long she left it near the fire to rise." Her brow furrowed. "Do you remember how many cups of flour?" "Enough to feed a hungry boy and a tired man. Let's find out what that means." That afternoon, the cabin transformed. They cleared the counters, measured carefully, argued gently over what was too much salt and what was not enough. Boone rolled up his sleeves, his thick forearms dusted with flour as he kneaded dough, while Letty stood beside him on the wooden crate, hands buried elbow-deep in the sticky mix. "You're not kneading," he told her. "You're poking." "I'm 6, she shot back. "My hands are still growing." "You've got to lean in, put your weight behind it." She tried again, tongue poking out the side of her mouth. Boone watched her small hands press and fold, press and fold. Her brows pinched in concentration. "Better," he said. They waited by the hearth while the dough rose in a bowl wrapped with a wool scarf. Letty told him how her mama used to hum while waiting. Boone, in turn, told her how his mother would flick his ears if he tried to sneak a piece early. "Did you like her cooking?" Letty asked. "She made the best molasses pie in 3 counties. You ever miss her?" He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Every damn day." She nodded, accepting that as truth, then added, "Me too." They baked the bread just past golden. Boone checked it like he remembered, tapping the bottom for the hollow sound, sniffing for that sweet, yeasty scent that said home. When it was done, they sat side by side at the table, warm slices torn by hand, butter melting into the steam. Letty took her first bite, then looked down at the book. She turned a page, then another, then pulled a pencil stub from her pocket. In the corner, in careful, crooked letters, she wrote, "Boone's bread, not Mama's, but still good." Boone saw it, said nothing, just reached for another piece. They didn't speak much that evening. The cabin held the peace of a shared task completed. Outside, snow fell soft and slow, like it had decided to be gentle for once. As Boone sat in his chair watching Letty curl up in the loft with her book and her stuffed rabbit, he realized something had changed in the air between them. It wasn't just the bread. It was the way she looked at him now, not as a stranger, but as someone who might actually stay. That night, Boone dreamed of his mother's kitchen, of molasses pie and songs hummed by the fire. He woke to the smell of something familiar, warm, spiced. She was up early, making breakfast again. This time the bread didn't burn. And as he stepped into the kitchen, watching the little girl in a too-big apron balancing on her crate with the sun peeking through the shutters, Boone didn't just see a guest anymore. He saw someone building a life inside his own. Outside, fresh tracks broke through the snow, too small for Boone, too light for trouble. But someone else had found them, a rider from the valley, headed straight for the cabin, carrying news that would shake what little peace they'd managed to find. The fishing rod started as a limb from an old lodgepole pine out back, one Boone had trimmed the previous autumn before the snows came in. It wasn't much to look at, a crooked piece of wood with bark still clinging to it, but it felt right in his hands, sturdy, seasoned, familiar. Every night after Letty climbed up into the loft and curled herself around that ragged stuffed rabbit of hers, Boone stayed up by the fire, knife in hand. He whittled slowly, working past knots and splinters until the shape began to show itself. A smooth handle shaped for smaller fingers, a taper so light and even that it almost hummed in his hand. He sanded it with worn canvas and rubbed it down with bear fat for weatherproofing. He didn't say anything to her about it. Boone wasn't a man for explanations, especially not when it came to gifts that mattered. But when it was finished, 4 days in, just before sunrise, he left it on the table beside her plate, with a single sentence scratched on a folded scrap of paper. Every soul near water should know how to fish. When Letty padded downstairs that morning in her blue cotton dress and mismatched socks, her breath caught. She touched the rod with 2 fingers first, as if afraid it might vanish. Then she picked it up and held it across her arms, turning it over, testing the balance. "You made this?" she asked, voice soft. Boone poured her coffee, just a splash in hot milk, and nodded. She stared at the rod like it was a crown or a sword. "It's beautiful. It's useful," he grunted. "That's more important. No one's ever made me something before." Boone didn't answer. He didn't have the words for what that felt like in his chest. An hour later, they were walking down the narrow trail behind the cabin, past where the pines opened up and the slope dipped toward a lazy bend in the creek. The morning air still held the cold bite of winter, but spring was near enough to soften the edges. Boone carried his old rod and a burlap sack with bread and cheese. Letty clutched her rod with both hands like a prayer. The creek ran clear over polished stones, the water quick but quiet. Boone pointed to the dock his grandfather had built, a slab of pine and cedar posts, weathered gray but still sturdy. They sat side by side, feet swinging over the water. He showed her how to tie a hook, how to bait it with worm or scrap, how to cast, slow and smooth, letting the line arc like a ribbon in the wind. "Fishing's not about catching," he told her. "It's about watching, listening, learning to be still. Good things come if you wait quiet enough. Papa used to say that," she whispered. "But Mama said sometimes you have to go make your own luck." Boone gave a short laugh. They were both right. They sat in silence, the line cutting through the current, their reflections rippling under the brightening sky. The forest whispered around them, pines rustling like distant voices, birds flickering between branches. 10 minutes passed, maybe 20. Then the line jerked in Letty's hand. Her eyes widened. She yelped, "I got something." "Hold steady," Boone said, calm but alert. "Let it pull, but don't let it take everything." She braced her knees and leaned back just enough to keep the tension. The rod bowed like a branch in wind. Boone reached to help, but she shook her head. "I got it." Together they coaxed the fish in a small trout, silver and speckled, flipping in the shallows at the edge of the dock. Boone reached down and scooped it into the net. "It's beautiful," Letty breathed, leaning over. "Do we have to kill it?" Boone paused. "That's the usual way." She crouched, studying the fish as it writhed, gills working like tiny bellows. It wasn't fear in her eyes, it was reverence. "I think it's too small," she said finally. "Maybe we should let it grow." "Try again tomorrow." Boone looked at her, the way her small hands cupped water over the trout's back, how gently she held the net as she lowered it. He'd hunted for meat since he was a boy, shot deer, cleaned birds, salted fish. Survival was the way of things. But watching Letty now, he understood something different. Sometimes sparing a life was also survival. Not for the fish, for the person doing the sparing. "All right," he said. She released the fish. It darted into deeper water, vanished like a secret into shadow. They sat together, empty-handed but richer somehow. Boone handed her a piece of bread and she nibbled at it, feet swinging. They didn't say much on the walk back. Just listened to the wind, the birds, the slow beat of footsteps over packed earth. That night, she added a new line to her mother's recipe book. "First catch. Too small. Let it go." Papa Boone said okay. She didn't ask permission to call him that. He didn't ask her to stop. The next few days followed a rhythm neither had planned, but both came to depend on. Mornings began with hot bread and jam burnt less each time, and then lessons in the woods. Boone taught her how to spot bear tracks, how to recognize edible plants, how to walk through dry leaves without a sound. She soaked it all up, her mind sharp as flint. But it wasn't just survival, she learned, it was presence. One afternoon they returned from gathering mushrooms to find a letter nailed to the front door. Torn envelope, red seal. Boone's name scrawled in ink he didn't recognize. He read it twice. Jaw tightened. "What is it?" Letty asked. He folded the letter, slid it into his vest. "Nothing yet. Just someone wondering about a little girl and a man who lives too far from town." She tilted her head. "Do we have to worry?" Boone looked past her, toward the distant valley and the smoke rising from chimneys in Buckhorn, toward the law and the town folk who liked things neat. "Not yet," he said. But he stepped out that night and split twice the firewood he needed, because in his gut, Boone knew what came next wasn't smoke or bread or fish. It was trouble, and this time it was coming from people, not snow. The first signs came quiet, not with horses or gunfire, but whispers. Boone had gone into Buckhorn just once since Letty arrived, and that was only to pick up salt, oil, and a spool of thread. He'd left her at the cabin with his hound, Jasper, and a loaded rifle by the door. The trip had been quick, but in a town like Buckhorn, even a 10-minute stop could plant seeds. By the end of that week, someone had seen her, a red-haired girl in a patched dress sitting at the edge of the woods, a young thing with no kinfolk in town. The whispers twisted from curiosity to concern, and from concern to suspicion. They called him the giant with the scar. "Used to ride with the vigilantes," one shopkeeper murmured. "Lives alone up on Pike's Ridge. Nobody's seen his kin in years. He's got a little girl living there now. Ain't Natural, the Women's Temperance League, never short on opinions, were the first to speak aloud what others only muttered. A man like that, hiding a child, Mrs. Adelia Combs scoffed. Either she's in danger or worse, he's hiding something of his own shame. By Sunday morning, those words reached the pulpit of First Grace Chapel. Reverend Claiborne had been a circuit preacher for 2 decades. He'd seen rough men with soft hearts and soft-talking men with rot inside. He didn't trust either until he looked them in the eye. So, that Monday, he rode his gray gelding through the snow-melt trails, coat buttoned high and Bible strapped to his saddle, heading for Pike's Ridge. Boone was chopping wood when he spotted the man riding up the slope. He paused mid-swing, sweat glistening on his temples, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Letty peeked from the porch, apron still dusted in flour. "Should I go inside?" "No," Boone said. "You stay with me." The preacher rode up slow and calm, dismounting with practiced grace. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face carved by time and wind. "Reverend Elliot Claiborne," he said, tipping his hat. "I come with no trouble, just questions." Boone didn't move. "What kind of questions?" "Town's talking. You've got a girl up here, red hair. Said she calls you Papa Boone. Folks are concerned." Letty stepped forward, then bold as a sunrise. "I ain't his blood, but he feeds me. Keeps me warm, teaches me how to shoot straight and speak honest. He didn't steal me." "I came." The Reverend turned to her, surprised. "And your name?" "Letty Mayfield. I'm 10. My mama died in the last freeze. He found me burying her myself." Silence stretched between them like taut rope. Claiborne studied her eyes, clear, steady, too old for her years, and nodded slowly. "That's so?" "She wrote her name in my mama's recipe book," Letty added. "Boone lets me keep it on the mantel." The Reverend looked toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. A clean porch, firewood stacked just right. No signs of harm. He sighed. "God sees truth clearer than men," he said finally. "But men make laws, and they don't like strange arrangements. You might have done right by her, Boone, but if someone presses the sheriff, this'll get bigger than talk. You need papers. Something official." Boone's jaw tightened. "There's no family left to sign anything." "No judge out here would grant me guardianship." "I know," Claiborne said gently, "but that won't stop trouble from coming." "Especially now," Letty folded her arms. "He's better than any father I could have wished for." The Reverend smiled faintly. "Child, sometimes the world don't care about what's true. It only sees what fits." They stood in silence after that, the 3 of them in the crisp mountain air, pines creaking in the wind. Before leaving, Claiborne handed Boone a folded paper from his coat. "Name of a notary in Canyon Rock. Owes me a favor. He might not ask too many questions if you go quick." Boone didn't thank him, but he didn't tear the paper either. The Reverend rode off the way he came, hooves thudding into melting snow. That night, Letty was quiet at supper. Her spoon clinked against the bowl, eyes down. "Am I going to be taken away?" she asked suddenly. "No," Boone said, "but the town, the sheriff." He reached across the table, laid one heavy hand over her small one. "Long as I'm breathing, you stay right here." That night, Boone opened the trunk at the back of his room. Inside was a coat with brass buttons, a satchel with faded army lettering, and a bundle of old papers tied with leather cord. He lit a lamp and began sorting through the past. Orders, maps, discharge letters, even an old letter from a colonel recommending Boone for a teaching post in Montana before the war hardened his soul. He pulled out one sheet in particular, a land grant with his full name. Boone Jeremiah Coulter. Official. Signed. It might not be enough, but it was a start. As he stared into the fire, the wind shifted outside. A twig snapped. He stood, rifle already in hand, and moved toward the door. Down the slope, barely visible in moonlight, a rider turned back toward Buckhorn, watching. Tomorrow wouldn't be quiet. It was during one of those slow, gray mornings that the truth finally came out. Snow had fallen all night and lay thick like wool across the ridge. Boone had stoked the fire early, made cornbread in the skillet, and set water to boil. Letty sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping pages of her mother's tattered notebook, tracing the fading ink with her finger. He noticed the faraway look in her eyes, the kind that meant her mind had drifted off somewhere colder than the mountain wind. "You ever want to talk about it?" Boone said, voice low. "I'm here." She didn't answer right away, just stared at a dried flower pressed between the pages. Then she closed the book. "I haven't told you how they died," she said. "My folks." Boone waited, silent. "We lived out near Cedar Hollow, on a patch of land near the lake. It wasn't big, but Papa built the cabin himself. Mama kept bees. Papa hunted and traded furs. When things got tight last winter, they heard of a sawmill opening east. Someone promised good pay." She shifted her weight, pulling her knees close. "They hitched our sled to the old mare, said they'd be gone 2 days. Just across the frozen lake and back. I watched them disappear from the porch." She looked up, eyes glassy. "But the ice gave way. I don't know how far they got. The mare came back alone the next morning, covered in frost, harness all tangled." Boone felt something twist in his chest. "I waited 2 days before I left. I wrapped Mama's notebook in a scarf, packed some jerky, and followed the shore. Never crossed the lake. Never saw them again." She picked at a loose thread on her skirt. "Folks in town let me stay for a bit. Called them aunties, though none were kin. One by one they passed me off, said they had their own mouths to feed. One family took my father's rifle as thanks, and then sent me away the next day." Boone's jaw tightened. "I walked mostly. Slept in barns. One night in a shed behind a church. Then I followed the creek north. Found your cabin by mistake." Boone rose from his chair and crossed the room, kneeling beside her. He didn't speak, just set a steady hand on her back. "You should have told me sooner," he said gently. "I thought you might send me away, too." He reached up to the mantel, pulled down the tin box where she kept her few things, and opened it. Beneath a folded scarf and the notebook was something he hadn't noticed before, a piece of folded paper sealed with brittle wax. He opened it carefully. It was a foreclosure notice, dated 3 months back. Official stamp. The property had been seized. The debt, just under $70, had consumed everything her parents had. Boone exhaled through his nose, long and low. He folded the paper again and set it back in the tin. "That house is gone," he said. "Ain't nothing left tying you to it." Letty nodded, swallowing hard. "I figured." He studied her for a long moment, a girl with nothing left but a notebook, a memory, and a spine made of quiet steel. "You stay," he said firmly. "Whatever comes, you stay." Her eyes widened slightly. "I mean it," Boone continued. "No more half-truths. No more hiding from town gossips. You're mine to look after now." A tear slipped down her cheek, not out of sadness, but something deeper. Relief, maybe, or the shock of finally being claimed by someone who didn't want anything in return. Later that evening, Boone sat sharpening his blade outside while Letty fed Jasper. A wind kicked up, sharp with ice, and something about it made Boone pause. He scanned the trees. That's when he saw it. A shadow, just beyond the edge of the tree line. A man, tall, wiry, wearing a bowler hat too fine for this country. Watching the cabin. Boone stood slowly. The figure turned and disappeared behind the ridge. Boone didn't chase. He didn't have to. Trouble had smelled the wind, and it was coming with a name. The sun was still low when the knock came, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor. No, this was the kind that filled Boone's chest with something tight and cold. He opened the door slow, rifle cradled loosely in one hand. A man stood on the porch, lean, sharp-jawed, and grinning like a fox caught in a chicken coop. He wore a dusty overcoat and a hat pulled low over mean eyes. A scar ran from his left nostril to the corner of his lip. His boots were polished too neat for any honest workman. "Name's Elmer Croft," he said, voice slick as oil. "I believe you've got something that belongs to me." Boone didn't move. "You're trespassing." Croft smiled wider. "I'm here for Letty. She's my stepdaughter, and the law says she's mine." Behind Boone, Letty's chair scraped against the floor. She stood frozen by the hearth, pale and silent. "You don't look like kin," Boone said, "and I don't recall hearing she had anyone looking for her." Croft's eyes flicked to the girl. "She ran off last winter. That house was mine. I took her in after her folks vanished. She was supposed to stay put. Instead, she stole from me." "Is that right?" Boone muttered. "She's just a girl." "Wild, needs proper discipline, and I've got every right to reclaim her." Boone stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "She says you used to hit her." Croft didn't flinch. "She says a lot of things. She's a liar like her mother. You think you're the first fool she's tricked?" Boone said nothing for a moment. His size alone cast a long shadow over the porch. Then, slow and firm, he spoke. "You're leaving this place." Now Croft narrowed his eyes. "I'll come back with papers. With the sheriff, if I have to. That girl's underage, and if you're keeping her, that makes you look suspect." "You come back," Boone said, voice low and steady, "and I won't be talking." Croft's smirk faded. He spit in the dirt, flicked a glance at Boone's rifle, then turned and walked off, boots crunching over frost-bitten leaves. But as he mounted his horse, he called over his shoulder, "This ain't over. The law'll be on your doorstep next. And so will I." Boone watched him ride off toward the slope, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Inside, Letty stood like a statue. "I knew he'd find me," she whispered. "I hoped, but I knew." "You're safe," Boone said, laying a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I'll see to that. But if he really brings the law—" He didn't answer right away. They sat in silence that night, Boone oiling his rifle, Letty writing in her notebook. The fire popping and sighing like it, too, sensed a storm brewing. By the next day, word had reached Buckhorn, and like prairie fire through dry grass, the town lit up with whispers. The ladies' temperance circle met twice that week. Some whispered that a man like Boone living alone with a child not his own couldn't be right. Others, especially those who knew of Croft's reputation, drinking, gambling, and a string of bruised women, started asking why a child would ever want to return to that. Reverend Wills, the same who had visited weeks before, stood at the church door that Sunday, pausing each family with gentle words. "There's a difference," he said softly, "between what's legal and what's just. Sometimes the law's slow to catch up with the Lord's truth, but not everyone shared his view." Mrs. Merton, sharp-nosed and sharper-tongued, declared, "I don't care what that man's done. That girl ain't his either, and she's underage. There are rules." Sheriff Albee, whose hands were more used to lifting mugs than justice, muttered that he wanted no part of it. "Let the county judge sort it out," he said. "Just don't bring it to my porch." Back at the cabin, Boone had begun building something in the shed, a second bunk, carved low to the ground. Letty helped him sand the edges, watching curls of wood fall like feathers. "You're really not scared?" she asked. Boone looked down at her, slow and calm. "Scared men let fear decide their actions. I'd rather stand on what's right. That night, Boone wrote a letter to a man named Red Cafferty, a man who owed Boone a favor from long ago, a lawyer who'd once walked away from the bench because he said too many judges confused robes for righteousness. Boone folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and sent it with a courier down the pass. By then, snow had started falling again, and in that white hush, Boone knew two things. The storm was coming, and if they didn't prepare now, everything could be taken from them. Truth be damned. 3 nights later, just after midnight, a rider came fast across the snow line. Boone stepped outside, rifle in hand, eyes narrowed. But it wasn't Croft. It was someone else, and they weren't alone. The sky had turned to steel by the time the riders came. 3 of them, black coats, black horses. Elmer Croft sat at the front like a king returned from war, smug and grinning beneath a bowler hat that didn't match the country. Behind him, 2 men with long rifles and no patience, hired guns. Boone could smell it before they even came close. Letty saw them first from the window and froze, the carving knife slipping from her hand to the table. Her breath hitched. Boone didn't ask. He knew. He stepped out onto the porch, calm as still water. 1 boot forward, rifle slung across his shoulder but untouched. He'd spent the morning splitting kindling, but now it felt like he'd been preparing for something else entirely. Croft pulled his horse up short at the gate. His voice carried across the clearing, smug and oily. "Didn't think I'd come back so soon, did you?" Boone didn't answer. "I told you, Boone. The law's slow out here, but bullets? They travel quick." Still, Boone didn't move. Croft chuckled and nodded to one of his men. The younger of the 2 cracked his knuckles and spat in the snow. Then the sound came from behind wagon wheels and voices, boots crunching snow, the clink of pots and skirts and saddle straps. The town had come. First was Reverend Wills, still in his black coat but with a shotgun across his saddle. Beside him, Mrs. Ida Thornberry, who ran the mercantile. She was holding a rolling pin like she meant to flatten more than dough. Then came 2 young ranch hands from the South Valley. Old Mr. Klein from the mill, who hadn't ridden in years. Even Marcy the seamstress, quiet as a mouse most days, carried her scissors like a badge of honor. They lined up behind Boone like a wall, silent, unmoving. Croft blinked. "What the hell is this?" Wills dismounted slowly and spoke first. "Community," he said. "You might have heard of it. We build things together, fix fences, bury each other's dead. We don't let bullies take our children." "This girl ain't yours," Croft snapped. "No," Wills replied. "But she's not yours either. And you sure as hell don't have a judge's order. You're just a man with a mouth and a pair of hired cowards." Croft sneered. "You all think this is justice." Boone stepped down off the porch and walked to the gate. His voice was steady. "You want to drag that child down the mountain, you'll have to go through me." Croft shifted in the saddle. Boone added, "And then you'll have to go through everyone behind me." One by one, the hired guns looked at each other. Not a man among them moved. Boone turned to face the crowd, then back to Croft, his voice louder now. "She's not a stranger anymore. She's family, she's loved, and if you want to test that, well, you'll find we're harder to break than she ever was." Someone in the crowd clapped, then others joined. Not a riot, not a cheer, just the kind of slow, grounded applause that says, "We're here, and we're done being quiet." Croft's grin faltered. His horse pawed at the snow. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "There's still laws." Wills stepped forward again. "Then bring them. Bring the sheriff. Bring a judge. But don't bring threats and guns to a place where people still pray over dinner and raise barns together." Croft stared them down one last time. Then he tugged his reins and turned, the hired guns following close behind. They didn't speak, didn't look back. Snow started falling as the riders disappeared into the trees. From the cabin doorway, Letty watched Boone in silence. He walked back to her, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not going anywhere, sweetheart." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't know people would stand for me." Boone crouched to her level. "You didn't ask them to. But they saw who you are." That's the difference, a camera clicked. Mr. Cormack, the town photographer, had been there the whole time. No one noticed him much. But now he stood holding the old lens box up on its tripod, face beaming. "Had to capture it," he said. "What I just saw, that's history." The photo made its way to the store window the very next week. A wide shot, Boone in front, solid as a tree trunk. Letty behind him on the porch, framed by pine. Townsfolk standing like a line of fence posts. The caption below read, "The Day Family Won." But Letty didn't see it that way. That night, after the fire died and the wind curled quiet outside the cabin, she pulled Boone's coat from the peg by the door and slipped a little envelope into the pocket. It was her mother's old note pressed between two folded pages of her journal. Boone would find it by morning, and the words written there would change everything he thought he knew about who Letty was. Boone found the note before sunrise. He was pulling his coat from the wall peg when it slipped from the pocket-creased paper, old and soft at the folds. Letty's handwriting ran small and tight across the page, the kind of script a child teaches herself by candlelight. It was a copy of her mother's final letter, the one she'd never let go of. "If anything ever happens to me, don't be afraid to love someone else." Let the right ones in Boone read it 3 times before folding it back and slipping it into his shirt pocket, close to his chest. The words had weight now, not just for her, but for him too. Later that morning, Reverend Wills came riding up with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He waved the paper in the air like a peace flag. "Adoption forms," he said with a grin, "straight from the judge in Delwood. Signed and sealed. All we need now is your name, Boone." Boone nodded. "Appreciate it, Reverend. But I'm thinking maybe we do it different." Wills blinked. "Different how?" Boone didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Letty, who sat on the porch steps, brushing Scout's fur with a pine twig. She looked up when she felt his gaze, eyes wide, questioning. Boone reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a simple gold band, worn but polished clean. "My mama's," he said, kneeling in the snow-packed dirt. "She wore it near 40 years. Said it kept her honest." Letty tilted her head. "You givin' that to me?" Boone chuckled. "Not yet. But I reckon it might help if folks knew you weren't just under my roof, but in my family. Real, legal, and heart-deep." She frowned. "You already love me." "I do," he said softly, "and that should be enough. But the world likes things written down, so if Marion helps quiet the talk, I'll do it. I'd do it for you." Letty's brows scrunched. "You gonna marry me?" Boone laughed gently. "No, darling. That wouldn't be proper. But there's someone I got in mind." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Clara Jo arrived that afternoon, riding a small roan horse and carrying a satchel full of worn books and chalk tins. She wasn't what most folks pictured when they said widow. She had copper-red hair tied tight at the nape and a gaze that missed nothing. For months, she'd sent stories and arithmetic problems up the mountain in parcels marked anonymous. Letty had known, but she'd never told Boone. Clara slid off the horse like she'd been born on one, her long skirt dusted with road salt and cold. "You get my letter?" she asked Boone, pulling her gloves off. He nodded. "Every word. I didn't think you'd answer by swinging a hammer." They both turned to look at the old schoolhouse. It had been nothing but a shell roof half-caved, windows broken, moss growing thick along the siding. But Boone had spent 3 days with the team from town fixing the foundation, cutting new beams and sealing up the glass. There was a stove now, desks salvaged from storage, even a fresh bell in the cupola. "I figured," Boone said slowly, "if I built a school, you might stay." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That's the closest thing to a proposal I've ever heard from a man who barely speaks." Boone shrugged. "Didn't figure I had to say it." "Just hoped you'd see it." Letty watched from the fence post, Scout curled beside her. There was something soft and swelling in her chest she didn't have words for, like spring trying to break through snow. The next Sunday, Clara held her first class. Not just Letty. 6 other children from the valley showed up, some on foot, some by wagon. Boone stood in the back, arms folded, pretending he wasn't listening. Clara read aloud from a leather-bound copy of Tom Sawyer, pausing to ask questions. Letty raised her hand so many times she nearly fell off her bench. The room smelled of pine soap and chalk dust. Boone had carved a new sign for the door, Clear Creek Schoolhouse, reopened 1887. That night, Clara stayed for supper. They ate rabbit stew and warm bread, and afterward Letty curled up by the hearth with a picture book and Scout's head in her lap. Boone stood and cleared his throat, hands fidgeting in his pockets. "I was wondering, Clara," she raised an eyebrow, "if I was to fix up that old cabin next to the creek, and if I was to fill it with your kind of books and space for your sewing, would you—" "Yes," she said before he finished, "but only if you keep talking in that shy, half-muttered way." "I've grown fond of it," Letty giggled from the floor. Boone exhaled, rubbing his neck. They never called it an engagement. No ring was exchanged, no kneeling. Just a quiet understanding between 3 souls that what they had was more than survival. It was belonging. But not everyone in town was ready to let things settle. The next morning, a letter arrived from the county courthouse. Not from the judge, but from the county registrar. There'd been a challenge filed against the adoption signed anonymously, with claims of Boone's unfit background, a reference to an incident years prior, and whispers about the legality of Letty's stay. Boone read the letter twice, and then he folded it neatly and slid it under the lantern. The firelight danced across his jaw as he whispered, "Looks like we're not done fighting for family just yet." The sound of hammers was no longer rare up in the hills. It began with Boone clearing space beside the old cabin. He worked slowly, measuring each plank of wood twice before placing it. Letty helped, handing him nails and sitting on the edge of the porch, reading her recipe book aloud, her voice light as birdsong. He doubled the size of the place, added a second room with a real bed for Clara, built shelves for books, and hung oil lamps in every corner. He replaced the warped floorboards and patched the roof until not a single drop of rain could sneak through. Neighbors came to help. Men from town, boys with nothing better to do, even 2 traveling lumbermen who happened to pass through and stayed a day longer, just for the stew Clara served them at dusk. And when the house was finally whole, warm and standing proud against the mountain's edge, something changed in the air. One by one, people returned. Not just townsfolk curious to see the outlaw-turned-schoolteacher and the girl with storm-colored eyes, but mothers with children clinging to their skirts, fathers carrying sacks of apples or jars of jam, old women with loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. They came bringing food, questions, and kindness. A new rhythm began. Children arrived in the mornings for Clara's school. Some walked miles from neighboring farms. Others were dropped off by wagon with a wave and a promise to return by dusk. They filled the little classroom with laughter and chalk dust, and the schoolhouse bell rang true every day at 8 sharp. Letty thrived. She wasn't the girl Boone had found trembling in the cold anymore. She was steady now, confident, with ink on her fingers and dirt on her knees from chasing stories in the garden. She helped Clara grade papers and wrote letters for the elders in town. But most importantly, she cooked. And one afternoon, she baked. Brown bread. She followed her mother's recipe to the letter: molasses, buttermilk, wholemeal flour. She stirred with her own hands, just like she remembered, whispering the steps under her breath the way her mother once had. Boone lit the oven for her, and Scout lay beside it like a lazy guardian. The loaf came out warm, rich, and perfect. No sinking in the middle, no burnt edges. Just right. She let it cool, then flipped open her recipe journal. On the top of the page, she wrote, "Mama's bread and Papa Boone's way." She didn't show it to anyone, but Boone saw her tuck it under her pillow later that night, a soft smile on her lips as she drifted off to sleep. Clara started organizing shared lunches every Friday. Each family brought something: pickled carrots, roasted chicken, hand-churned butter. Boone, never much for socializing, found himself at the center of things, passing out firewood and carving extra benches from fallen pine. One Friday, near the end of October, a photographer came up the hill. He said he'd heard about the school, about the new family who lived above the clouds, and wanted to capture the moment before winter set in. Folks cleaned themselves up quick. Clara pressed her dress, a simple white linen one she used to wear in church, back when she still believed in gathering. Letty wore a hand-stitched skirt with little birds sewn along the hem. Boone combed his hair, straightened the buttons of his vest, and dusted off the brown hat he only wore on Sundays. They stood in front of the hearth, warm fire behind them. Boone stood tall and still. Clara rested a hand on Letty's shoulder. Letty, with the recipe book hugged close to her chest, stood right between them. A soft light from the fire danced across their faces. The photographer's bulb flashed, and the moment was sealed. Later, he delivered the photograph, printed and framed. It hung by the cabin door. Beneath it, etched in neat handwriting, were the words, "The day we stopped being alone." But peace has a way of stirring old shadows. Just as the last guest left that evening, a horse's cry echoed down the mountain trail. Boone stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as a lone rider approached, coat dark with road dust, hat low over his brow. The man dismounted without a word, handed Boone a folded letter, then turned and vanished into the trees. Boone opened the letter in silence. His face didn't change, but his hands tightened at the edges. Clara stepped beside him. "What is it?" Boone passed her the page. It was from a lawyer, representing the estate of one Jonathan Croft. Apparently, Croft had died 2 days prior, but his will left behind a cruel surprise, a final legal claim on Letty, filed under old territorial codes, a technicality that hadn't been dismissed. Croft's cousin, a banker in Amarillo, was seeking guardianship, citing moral questions about Boone's status and Clara's living arrangement. They were giving Boone 7 days to respond. After that, the law would come knocking. Letty appeared in the doorway behind them, recipe book still clutched to her chest. "Are we still a family?" she asked softly. Boone looked down at her, then back toward the darkening trail. His jaw tightened. His voice was low and steady. "We're not just a family, Letty. We're a fortress, and I reckon it's time we show them what that means." The mountain hadn't changed much, but everything else had. The path to the cabin was worn now, packed down by a decade of footsteps, small boots, wagon wheels, even a few canes. It curled past the schoolhouse, which had been painted twice since Clara took it over, and continued up to the porch where Boone now spent most of his mornings, whittling fishing rods for kids who didn't yet know the patience of the stream. Time had laid its hands gently on them all. Boone's hair had silvered, and his joints moved slower, but his eyes still scanned the horizon like they did the day he pulled Letty from the snow. Clara still wore her white linen dresses, now with reading glasses perched on her nose. And Letty, she was a woman grown now, tall, capable, sharp-eyed, with a voice that could calm storms and a will just as strong as Boone's ever was. She had become the soul of this place. People came and went. Some stayed for months, others just long enough to get their bearings. But the cabin was never empty. There was always one more chair at the table, one more mug on the shelf. The school had expanded to 3 rooms. Boone's old tools were now being used by boys who once couldn't write their names. Letty taught sewing and bread-making on Saturdays, often reading aloud the old recipe journal where her handwriting now stood beside her mother's. And that morning, the sun rose just like any other. Boone was sitting in his favorite chair, Scout's grandpup curled up beside him, when the knock came. Not loud, just 2 short taps. Letty was in the kitchen, hands dusted in flour, rolling out biscuits. She opened the door. A boy stood there, maybe 12, with a worn hat too big for his head and a rope belt holding up his trousers. His cheeks were hollow, his boots nearly falling apart, but he stood straight. "They told me I could come here," he said, eyes not quite meeting hers. "I don't talk much." "But I can build fences." Letty tilted her head, studying him for a moment. Then she smiled. It was the same smile Boone once gave her, that first night, when he handed her a blanket and said nothing at all. "Well," she said, stepping aside, "I guess you're home. And maybe you'll teach us something too." He stepped over the threshold slowly, like it was a dream he hadn't dared believe until just now. Clara appeared from the other room with a cup of warm milk. Boone looked up from his carving, nodded once, and pointed to the empty chair across the fire. That night, after the table was cleared and the dishes dried, Letty climbed a small ladder to the attic and returned with something folded under her arm. She stepped onto the porch where Boone sat, watching stars blink into view. She hung it gently on the line, newly sewn, carefully stitched. A quilt, made from their old clothes. Boone's worn flannel shirts, Clara's faded aprons, Letty's childhood dresses. Each square carried a memory, a fire, a laugh, a silence shared during a storm. It waved gently in the evening breeze, a patchwork of belonging, a testimony to warmth, to rebuilding, to doors that never stayed closed for long. As the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and far-off pine, Boone turned to Letty. "You ready?" he asked softly. "For what?" "To do it again," he said. "Open the door. Let the next one in." She smiled, eyes glinting. "Always." And somewhere down the mountain trail another pair of feet was already walking, another story beginning. If you've made it this far with us, we hope you'll stick around, because the mountain always has room for one more. More tales of found family, quiet courage, and doors that stay open waiting just for you. Subscribe now to Western Legacy, and don't miss the next story. Who knows? The next knock might be yours.